On the afternoon of December 5, 1945, the sky above Fort Lauderdale belonged to that peculiar species of weather that unnerves even experienced pilots. A heavy blanket of cloud pressing down on the Atlantic coast, the air thick and restless, the sea below churning in shades of pewter and slate. It was the kind of day when the horizon dissolved into uncertainty, when up and down became negotiable concepts, when the mind could play tricks if you let it. The war had been over for 3 months. Victory had been declared, celebrations had faded, and now the great machinery of American military aviation was turning its attention to the mundane business of training the next generation of flyers. Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale, a sprawling complex of runways and hangars carved from the Florida scrubland, hummed with the rhythms of peacetime routine. Young pilots practiced their approaches, mechanics crawled over aircraft engines, and somewhere in the operations room, flight plans were filed and approved with the bureaucratic certainty that nothing could go wrong on a standard training mission over familiar waters. But something was wrong that day, though nobody could have known it yet. The wrongness began not with equipment failure or navigational error, but with a feeling, a sense of reluctance that Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor could not shake as he arrived late at the flight line, his uniform slightly rumpled, his expression carrying a weight that had nothing to do with the weather. Taylor was no novice. At 28 years old, he possessed the kind of combat experience that commanded respect in any ready room. He had logged more than 2,500 flight hours, had flown combat missions in the Pacific Theater, had seen friends die in flames and water, and had returned home with the calm, weary competence of a man who understood what aircraft could do and what the ocean could take. His service record was exemplary. His skill was unquestioned. Yet that afternoon, something in him balked at the prospect of leading Flight 19 on what should have been a routine navigation exercise over the Bahamas. He had asked to be excused from the mission. The request was unusual, perhaps unprecedented for a pilot of his caliber, but Taylor had made it nonetheless. The reasons remain obscure. Some accounts suggest he simply felt unwell. Others hint at a darker premonition, that inexplicable anxiety that sometimes visits men before disaster. Whatever his motivation, the request was denied. The mission required an experienced flight leader, and Taylor was that man. Orders were orders, even in peacetime, even when the war's urgency had faded into the background noise of daily operations. And so he climbed into the cockpit of his TBM Avenger, that formidable torpedo bomber that had proven itself in countless Pacific engagements, and prepared to lead 13 other men into the gray afternoon. The 5 Avengers sat on the tarmac in a neat row, their massive propellers gleaming dully in the filtered light. These were not elegant aircraft. They were blunt instruments of naval warfare, heavily armored, designed to carry a devastating payload and return to their carriers even when riddled with enemy fire. Each plane carried a crew of 3, a pilot, a turret gunner, and a radio man. 14 men in total across 5 aircraft, all of them trained, all of them capable, all of them confident in the routine nature of what lay ahead. The mission profile was straightforward, the kind of exercise these squadrons flew regularly. Depart Fort Lauderdale, fly east to a bombing range known as Hens and Chickens Shoals, conduct practice runs on decommissioned target ships, then continue east to Grand Bahama Island before turning back toward the Florida coast. Navigation training, bombing practice, formation flying, the fundamental skills of naval aviation, performed countless times before by countless crews. At 2:10 in the afternoon, the 5 Avengers roared down the runway and lifted into the uncertain sky. The thunder of their engines faded gradually as they banked eastward over the Atlantic, disappearing into the haze that hung between sea and cloud. For the men at Fort Lauderdale, their departure marked the beginning of another unremarkable afternoon. The tower logged their takeoff time. The operations officer filed the appropriate paperwork, and everyone assumed they would see those 5 aircraft return in a few hours. Their pilots tired but satisfied, their mission accomplished without incident. But the afternoon was anything but unremarkable. Out over the water, as Flight 19 completed its bombing runs and turned toward Grand Bahama, something began to unravel. The weather, already marginal, was deteriorating rapidly. What had been merely overcast was thickening into something more ominous, a gathering darkness that seemed to rise from the ocean itself. Visibility contracted. The sea below became a gray abstraction, impossible to judge for distance or direction. And then, around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the radio operators at Fort Lauderdale began picking up transmissions that made no sense. The first indication of trouble came as a question, Taylor's voice cutting through the static with an uncertainty that immediately commanded attention. "I don't know where we are. We must have got lost after that last turn." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Lost. That word should have been impossible for a flight of experienced pilots flying a well-known training route in broad daylight within range of multiple radio beacons and navigational aids. Yet there it was, spoken with a flatness that suggested not panic but a far more disturbing emotion, bewilderment. The radio operators leaned closer to their equipment, adjusting frequencies, trying to establish clear communication. Other pilots monitoring the training frequency heard the transmission and exchanged glances. Lost meant something had gone fundamentally wrong, not just with navigation but with the basic relationship between aircraft and Earth that made flight possible. The controllers at Fort Lauderdale responded immediately, asking for Taylor's position, his heading, what he could see. But the answers that came back made the situation not clearer but infinitely more confused. Taylor reported that his compasses were malfunctioning. Both of them, the magnetic compass and the gyro compass, were spinning uselessly, providing no reliable heading. In the featureless gray environment in which Flight 19 now found itself, without the sun to provide orientation and without ground features visible through the cloud cover, the compasses were everything. They were the thin thread connecting the aircraft to the world, the tool that transformed blind flying from suicide into manageable risk. But if the compasses were wrong, if they were spinning and contradicting each other, then the most fundamental instrument of navigation had become a source of lethal confusion. The base controllers, hearing this, immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Compass failure in a single aircraft was unusual but manageable. The pilot could follow his wingman. But Taylor was reporting compass problems across the entire flight, all 5 aircraft apparently experiencing the same mysterious malfunction. This was not just unusual, it was virtually unprecedented. Compasses were simple, robust instruments. They rarely failed, and for 5 separate compasses to fail simultaneously suggested something profoundly wrong with either the equipment or the environment in which they were operating. The controllers advised Taylor to fly west. Simple enough, if you're lost over the Atlantic east of Florida, flying west will eventually bring you to land. It was the most basic rule of survival navigation, the kind of advice that required no sophisticated calculation. But Taylor's response revealed the depth of his disorientation. He believed they were somewhere over the Gulf of Mexico, not the Atlantic. He thought they had somehow overflown the entire Florida peninsula and were now west of the state, looking at open water that extended hundreds of miles in every direction except east. If that were true, then flying west would take them deeper into the Gulf, away from land. Flying east would be the correct choice, toward the Florida coast, toward safety. But Taylor was wrong. The evidence later reconstructed from radio bearings and timing would show that Flight 19 was actually northeast of the Bahamas, with the Florida coast lying to the west exactly as the controllers had advised. Yet in the cockpit of that lead Avenger, fighting failing instruments and deteriorating weather, looking down at an ocean that provided no clues to direction or position, Taylor made a decision based on his mistaken certainty. He ordered the flight to turn northeast, away from Florida, toward the open Atlantic. The other pilots in the formation were now caught in a terrible dilemma. They could hear Taylor's uncertainty, could sense that something was fundamentally wrong with the navigation, but they were trained to follow their flight leader. Military discipline, the entire structure of formation flying, depended on that principle. To break away, to make an independent decision, required not just courage but a willingness to countermand a superior officer's judgment. One of the junior pilots, perhaps sensing the danger, suggested that if they simply flew west, they would hit the coast. The radio transmission carried a note of desperate reasonableness, a plea for the obvious solution. But Taylor, locked into his conviction that they were over the Gulf, rejected the advice. Northeast they would fly toward what he believed was safety. As the afternoon wore on, the situation deteriorated from bad to catastrophic. The weather continued to worsen. The already heavy cloud cover thickened into something impenetrable, a gray void that swallowed visibility completely. The sea below, when glimpsed through gaps in the clouds, offered nothing useful, just endless repetition of waves and foam, a fractal pattern that could be anywhere or nowhere. The radio transmissions from Flight 19 took on an increasingly desperate quality. Taylor's voice, once calm and authoritative, began to betray stress. Other voices broke through. Gunners or radio men asking questions, expressing fear, seeking reassurance that could not be given. Back at Fort Lauderdale, the operations room had transformed into a crisis center. Officers crowded around the radio equipment, trying to guide the lost flight home through increasingly garbled transmissions. The atmospheric conditions were playing havoc with radio propagation. Signals would fade in and out, sometimes clear enough to hear every word, sometimes reduced to meaningless static. Other aircraft in the area were ordered to monitor the frequency to try to establish contact, to act as radio relays. The base commander was notified. Rescue assets were alerted. But everyone involved understood a fundamental truth. Without accurate navigation, without knowing where Flight 19 actually was, there was very little they could do except listen and hope. The daylight was dying. December days in Florida are short, and by late afternoon the sun was already sinking toward the western horizon, hidden behind the cloud cover but steadily withdrawing its light from the world. For the pilots of Flight 19, this represented a new and terrifying dimension to their predicament. Night flying over water was dangerous even under the best circumstances, with functioning instruments and known position. To face nightfall while lost, with failing compasses and dwindling fuel, was to confront almost certain death. The TBM Avenger, for all its virtues as a combat aircraft, was not forgiving of navigational error. Its fuel capacity was finite, its ability to glide after engine failure limited by its heavy design. Once the fuel ran out, once those massive radial engines coughed and died, the aircraft would have perhaps minutes before they hit the water. And hitting the Atlantic at night, in heavy seas, was not something anyone survived. The fuel situation was becoming critical. Taylor and his crews had been in the air for hours now, much longer than the planned mission duration. The Avenger's tanks were approaching empty. In the cockpits, the fuel gauges were dropping toward zero, and every pilot understood what that meant. The radio transmissions reflected this growing urgency. Someone asked about fuel levels. Someone else calculated how much time they had left. The answers were not encouraging. 30 minutes, 20, maybe less. And then came the transmission that would become the most haunting evidence of Flight 19's final moments. Taylor's voice, distorted by static but unmistakable in its resignation. All planes close up tight. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together. The words carried the weight of military tradition, of formations that stayed together even unto death, but they also represented a surrender to the inevitable. Taylor was acknowledging that they were not going to find land, that rescue was not coming in time, that the only choice left was how they would face the end. Together, as a unit, maintaining the discipline and cohesion that had been drilled into them from their first day of training. The controllers at Fort Lauderdale, hearing this, redoubled their efforts. They tried everything, different frequencies, different approaches, attempting to vector the flight toward land using radio bearings. But the transmissions were becoming fainter, more broken by static, harder to understand. And then, sometime after 7 p.m., the radio went silent. No distress calls, no final words, just the abrupt absence of signal. Flight 19 had vanished as completely as if it had flown into another dimension. The immediate response was swift and comprehensive. Even as night fell completely over the Florida coast, even as the weather continued to deteriorate into something genuinely dangerous, the Navy launched a rescue operation of staggering scale. The PBM Mariner flying boats, large, twin-engine aircraft designed for long-range maritime patrol, were perfect for this kind of emergency. They could stay airborne for hours, could land on water if necessary, carried extensive radio equipment and search gear. One of these mariners, with a crew of 13 men, was dispatched almost immediately into the storm-tossed darkness to search for any sign of Flight 19. 23 minutes after takeoff, the Mariner vanished. The last communication from the aircraft was routine, confirming their position and search pattern. And then, like Flight 19 before them, the rescue aircraft simply ceased to exist. No distress call, no indication of mechanical failure, no explanation. A ship in the area reported seeing a fireball in the sky at approximately the right time and location, suggesting a catastrophic explosion, but no wreckage was ever found. The rescue mission had become another tragedy, another set of families waiting for men who would never return. By dawn on December 6th, the situation was clear. 6 aircraft and 27 men were missing. The Navy's response was unprecedented in its scope. They assembled one of the largest search and rescue operations in American history, 248 aircraft of various types, 18 ships, ranging from destroyers to submarines to Coast Guard cutters, all converging on the waters east of Florida. The search area covered hundreds of thousands of square miles, from the Bahamas to the open Atlantic, from the Florida coast to the edges of the Gulf Stream. For 5 days, the operation continued around the clock. Aircraft flew grid patterns at low altitude, their crews scanning the ocean for any sign of wreckage, life rafts, oil slicks, floating debris. Ships steamed back and forth, their lookouts posted with binoculars, their sonar systems probing the depths. They found nothing. Not a single piece of wreckage, not one life vest, not a drop of oil, not any evidence whatsoever that 6 aircraft and 27 men had ever existed. The ocean had swallowed them completely, had erased every trace of their passage as if they had never been. This absence of evidence was perhaps more disturbing than any wreckage could have been. Crashes leave debris. Aircraft are filled with hundreds of components that float: seat cushions, fuel tanks, wooden parts, personal effects. The Atlantic should have been littered with the remnants of 6 aircraft, yet somehow it contained nothing at all. The Navy convened a board of inquiry to investigate the disaster. The hearings were thorough, examining every aspect of the mission, the flight plan, the weather forecasts, the aircraft maintenance records, Taylor's service history, the radio transcripts. Witnesses testified about what they had heard, what they had seen, what they believed had happened. The investigators tried to piece together a coherent narrative from the fragmentary evidence, to find an explanation that made sense of the inexplicable. Their initial conclusion was as controversial as it was harsh. The board blamed Taylor's mental aberration for the disaster, suggesting that he had become confused and disoriented for psychological rather than navigational reasons, that his leadership failures had doomed the entire flight. This finding outraged Taylor's family and fellow officers. Whatever had happened out there over the Atlantic, it was not the result of mental instability. Taylor had been an experienced, decorated pilot with an exemplary record. The suggestion that he had suffered some kind of breakdown was both unsupported by evidence and deeply unfair to his memory. Under pressure, the Navy revised its findings. The official cause was changed to unknown, a rare admission by any military service that it simply could not explain what had happened. This agnostic conclusion was probably closer to the truth than any specific theory could have been. The compass failures, the radio difficulties, the complete absence of wreckage, these suggested something unusual, perhaps even unprecedented, but not necessarily supernatural or impossible to understand. Over the years, theories accumulated like barnacles on a sunken hull. Some were plausible. A combination of compass malfunction and spatial disorientation, leading to a fatal navigational error. Some were technical. Speculation about magnetic anomalies in that region of the Atlantic, about unusual atmospheric conditions that might affect instrumentation. And some were fantastical. The Bermuda Triangle legend that would grow around Flight 19 like a mythology, transforming a tragic accident into evidence of mysterious forces, alien intervention, dimensional portals, or other concepts that belonged more to science fiction than historical analysis. The Bermuda Triangle narrative has its own strange power. Writers and documentarians have returned to Flight 19 again and again, using it as the centerpiece of a larger story about a supposedly cursed region of ocean where ships and aircraft vanish under mysterious circumstances. The triangle's boundaries are vaguely defined, somewhere between Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, and its supposed effects are equally vague. Compasses malfunction. Electronics fail. Time itself becomes unstable. These stories sell books and fill television hours, but they rest on a foundation of selective evidence and sensationalized interpretation. The truth is simultaneously more mundane and more terrible. Flight 19 was lost because navigation over open water is difficult, because weather can be deadly, because instruments sometimes fail, because even experienced pilots can become disoriented when every visual reference is stripped away. The ocean is vast and indifferent, capable of swallowing aircraft and ships with ease, leaving no trace beyond the absence of those who ventured onto its surface. The Pacific War had proven this thousands of times over: aircraft that vanished, ships that sank, men who simply disappeared into the immensity of ocean and were never found. In 1991, a new development briefly reignited hope for answers. Wreckage matching the description of TBM Avengers was discovered off the Florida coast, and for a moment it seemed that Flight 19 had finally been found. But subsequent investigation disproved the connection. The wreckage was from other aircraft, from other tragedies, from the countless incidents that had scattered military hardware across the ocean floor during decades of training and combat operations. Flight 19 remained lost, its exact fate as mysterious as ever. The families of those 27 men never received the closure that bodies provide, never had graves to visit or remains to bury. The memorial services held in the weeks after the disappearance were conducted without the presence of the dead, ceremonies of absence rather than farewell. For the mothers and fathers, the wives and children, the siblings and friends, this lack of finality must have been its own special torture. The mind recoils from uncertainty, wants to know how and where and why. Without answers, grief becomes suspended animation, a wound that cannot heal because it cannot be properly acknowledged. What remains is the mystery itself, preserved in radio transcripts and official reports, in the memories of those who listened to those final transmissions, in the vast emptiness of ocean where 5 aircraft and 14 men simply ceased to be. The disappearance of Flight 19 represents something fundamental about the human condition: our vulnerability in the face of natural forces, our dependence on technology that can fail, our capacity for courage even when confronting certain death. Those pilots, flying into darkness over hostile water with fuel running out and no hope of rescue, maintained their formation to the end. All planes close up tight. The phrase echoes across the decades, a testament to discipline and comradeship, but also to the absolute finality of disaster. On quiet days at Fort Lauderdale, when the weather is clear and the Atlantic stretches blue and peaceful toward the horizon, it is possible to imagine 5 Avengers lifting into the sky, their engines throttled up, their crews confident and capable. It is possible to imagine them turning east, toward the bombing range, toward their routine mission. And then it is necessary to imagine them not returning, to picture that same sky empty at dusk, to hear the silence where radio transmissions should have been. The base is different now, converted to civilian use, its military structures long since repurposed or demolished. But the ocean remains unchanged, keeping whatever secrets it claimed that December afternoon when the light failed and the compass needle spun uselessly and 14 men realized they were not going home. Flight 19 vanished 79 years ago, but its disappearance retains a peculiar power to disturb and fascinate. Perhaps this is because the mystery remains genuinely unsolved, or perhaps because it touches something primal in us. The fear of being lost, of having our instruments fail, of facing death in complete confusion about how we arrived at that moment. Taylor's reluctance to fly that day, his request to be excused, adds a layer of tragic irony. He knew something was wrong, sensed it in whatever way humans perceive danger before it manifests, but the machinery of military routine overrode his intuition. Would another pilot have made different decisions out there over the Atlantic? Would anyone have been able to navigate successfully when every compass was providing contradictory information? These questions cannot be answered. The ocean keeps its secrets. The families keep their grief. And we, decades removed from the event, can only reconstruct the story from fragments, can only imagine what those final hours must have been like as fuel gauges dropped and darkness gathered and the radio signals grew weaker and fainter until they dissolved entirely into static. Flight 19 is out there still, somewhere in the depths, its aluminum skin corroding in the salt water, its instruments frozen at whatever readings they showed when the aircraft hit the surface. 14 men are still at their stations, still close up tight in their formation, still waiting for the rescue that never came and never will. The ocean rolls over them eternally, indifferent to their names and stories, holding them in a silence more complete than any grave on land could provide. This is what remains. The mystery, the absence, the unanswered questions, and the terrible certainty that on December 5, 1945, something went profoundly wrong in the sky above the Atlantic, and every attempt to understand exactly what happened has ended in speculation and incomplete evidence. Flight 19 did not disappear into another dimension or through a portal to another world. It crashed into the ocean, somewhere, somehow, for reasons that seemed clear to the investigators but which remain fundamentally mysterious in their totality. The legend will persist. The Bermuda Triangle stories will continue to be told and retold, each iteration adding new embellishments and removing inconvenient facts. But beneath the mythology lies the simple, irreducible truth of human tragedy. 14 experienced men flew into uncertain weather and never returned, and the ocean kept them and keeps them still.